Well, we took advantage of the medical side. We didn't have much medical apparatus, but we had the Royal Army Medical Corps and the Australian Medical Corps. They were great guys, but they were allowed to keep certain. They had boxes and haversacks with bits and pieces of medical supplies, and this is where we kept the hand grenades till they were gone. And they were well hidden and they were well searched. But on the other hand, before the Japanese before we surrendered to the Japanese on the island of Singapore, the Royal Army Ordnance Corps made some, I can't describe it to you, some rice containers, water containers that you carry in the army, 2 containers, they're about 2 feet high and they're hollow, which would take hot food or cold food for the British Army. Well, they made false bottoms, and in those false bottoms they put certain articles, and as I've described in my book, there's parts of a crystal radio set, batteries we got from natives that worked, and screwed on. And I had one unpleasant experience where the Japs suspected something on the rail trip. I missed it out on the rail trip up country, and I was carrying 2, but I knew I got a radio in the bottom of each part, in each earphones in one, and this tucked, all screwed on the bottom. And this Jap guard was very suspicious of me, and I said, you know, I only got rice, only food, and he made me tip it out on the dirt and tip the other one out. And I must confess that I knew, because the intelligence officer said, you know what you're carrying, you know, your life's, you volunteered to do this. I said, yeah, if we can get news. It didn't work in the end, but it worked for a time. And this Jap guard came up to me and stood looking at me. He had his gun on me, and the guys were all looking at me, and this intelligence officer at the time was standing back, and I think he was scared. And my blood just froze in my veins, because he picked this container up. Now the rice was on the floor, on the dirt, picked it up, looked at it, sniffed it, turned it up, threw it down and kicked it. And I thought, my God, if it comes undone at the end, I'm a dead man, you know. But it didn't, and that was one way that we did that. And we operated that until the officer concerned, Captain Scrimminger was one, I don't know. Anyway, they caught 2 officers, and their death, I wouldn't like to describe the way they put them to death, and they kicked what was left of their bodies, quivering mass of blood and pulp. These 6 Japanese animals kicked the bodies of these 2 officers to the latrine seething maggots and kicked them into it. And we stood looking helpless while they did this. And that was the end of our operating of radio sets. Other things were kept, funnily enough, digging in the ground, and I kept a diary which survived. This is where most of my notes have come from. And at one stage, the Kimpi Tai, who I haven't mentioned, the Japanese secret police. Now the average Japanese was bad enough. The Kimpi Tai, they weren't all little guys either. They had some 6-foot guys amongst them, and I think they could say they were well on the par with the German Gestapo, because they were the Gestapo, the Kimpi Tai. They were the specialists. They came in searching camp, and even the Japanese commandant was scared of them. And I remember one day I was pretty sick, and all we had to wear then was a G-string, a loincloth, call it what you will. There were crude names for these things. That was all we had, nothing else. And they even got the sick, and we lay in there with dysentery, malaria, made us stand in the alleyways while they dug around, and I froze because my notes were in this little tin just below there, and I reckon the Japanese bayonet must have come within 2 inches of it, and I thought, well, if he hits it, that's my lot, because I have so much evidence against Japanese. I recorded for their murders and the murders of my comrades, you know, that they carried out. I want to give evidence to the War Crimes Tribunal after the war if I survived. I thought the world should know, and they should be punished for these crimes. And to my relief, the Japanese officer shouted this guard who was digging there, and I never felt so good in all my life, although I was starving. And I thought, he's missed it. And I put my hand down and I could feel this metal box, and I just shut the earth and I rolled on it, and I thought, and it went. And that survived the war, although ironically, when I dug it up after the war, most of the notes had been obliterated. I had to rewrite. But this painting that George Old, who lives on Canvey Island, done of me, survived, and I've still got it. I haven't got it, it's upstairs. If you call on me again, I'll gladly give it to you to have a shot of it. It's, the original is still there. I've had it reproduced in the book.
Has any of the notes at all survived in the original form?
No, not really, no, because they were, the humidity in the soil and that, and I lost a lot on transit to Burma. I don't know how it happened because we hadn't much. I think our own people were responsible because when we arrived in Burma, you may not believe this, we got on the Dakota, twin Dakota aircraft in Rangoon, in Bangkok, 30 to a plane, not like the planes we know today, the twin engine Dakotas, and they had metal seats right back, little tiny windows, and ironically we flew back over the course of the River Kwai, and we could see, we went quiet, we could see the big patches where the cemeteries, 10,000 there, 8,000 there, across the Andaman Sea, and landed on the outstrips on an emergency strip in Rangoon in Burma, and went into military hospitals, what was left of Rangoon. And when we got off the aircraft in Rangoon, we were sort of taken to a tent, and we were told to take our loincloths off. Our own people wouldn't touch us, the home medic, and we had to drop these into a burning incinerator. Then we had to go into another tent where there was men all covered up with protective gear, and they were spraying us from head to foot. Then we had to be bathed. We had to be sprayed again as if we, and they didn't believe we were English. We were so brown and yellow and so skinny. I weighed about 6 stone 1 pound, I think, when I first weighed. My normal weight's about 12 stone. So it gives us some idea. And I think most of my notes were lost then, but my memory was good, so I sat down, lay down in the hospital, and I wrote and I wrote and I wrote all I've been relating to. And on those notes I drew my story that I've told today, which I know is a story that young people might say, well, it's beyond belief. But I just want to assure you, it's a very true story, and it all really happened all those years ago.